Hello, everybody. This session is kind of like a refresher for Deluge. So I'm going to assume that you have either been writing Deluge in the past and maybe you just feel a little bit rusty because you haven't done it in a couple months, or that you have enough programming experience that learning Deluge should be pretty easy and your skills will transfer. So that is the assumption. If you think what I have described does not sound like you, that is okay. So what does Deluge mean? Data-enriched language for the universal grid environment. It is an acronym. Okay, so what is special about Deluge? It lets you create complex workflows very, very quickly. And that's what we have designed it to do. The reason that we decided to make a proprietary language rather than just starting Creator out with an existing programming language was several reasons. One was we could make it a lot more secure, and we could ensure that it was secure in a way that we just couldn't with other languages until we put a lot of time into that. Another reason is just that we were able to optimize Deluge to work in the Zoho ecosystem and to optimize it so that way you could get up and running pretty quickly. So that was the idea. All right, so the other thing is that it lets you avoid a lot of complexity as a programmer. So you don't have to think about the scalability of your application, the security of your application. You don't have to worry about caching issues. You don't have to even really worry about UI issues if you're building a Creator application, because we give you all those pre-made elements. And so yeah, like it is perhaps a little bit more limiting to build something in Creator than to just build it from scratch. Of course it's going to be more limiting, but those limitations are also the greatest strength of Deluge and Zoho Creator, because that is what allows you to get up and running quickly and to develop very, very fast. All right, so which applications can trigger Deluge functions? If you've just been living in Creator world for a while, you may not have realized that we actually have Deluge in a whole bunch of other Zoho applications. Pretty much every Zoho application. I don't know which ones don't have it. That might be a better question. But any place where you would want to have it, we either have added it or it will be added soon. And which app's data can Deluge access? So pretty much any Zoho application. And so the reason for that is because with Deluge, you can write get calls, you can write post calls. And so really, you can talk to any kind of SaaS application that has get or post APIs available. And so that's why we list so many different Zoho applications. But also, one of the things I'll talk about towards the end of this session is that we also give you a shorthand way of writing API calls when you're working with certain Zoho APIs. And so these are called the Deluge integration tasks, and they allow you to do something like create a lead in Zoho CRM or get a bunch of records from Zoho Books without having to write like a full-on get or post API call. It kind of gives you a faster way of doing it. So that is all the setup I have for you. Now let's go over the scripting basics. These are the things that I am going to cover. These are all kind of like programming 101 topics: data types, syntax, operators, conditionals, and let's just kind of go over how you do all of these in Deluge. So first one, data types. In Deluge, we have a few main data types. So text is indicated by quotation marks. We call that a string in Deluge, or now we're starting to kind of call it text. Then we treat numbers and decimals differently. So if you get an error message when you're writing a script and it tells you something about a big int, it's just really talking about an integer or a number. Decimals are treated a little bit differently. You may also see that referred to as a float in a few places, like in more traditional programming. And then we have date and time data. So we have a way of structuring time data, and there's a bunch of built-in functions that allow you to manipulate dates and times much more easily. So obviously, when you're writing a script, I think we all kind of know this, but you want to have the right data type in place because it'll make it a lot easier to manipulate the information that you're working with. Then there's Boolean. Just a true or false, so you can indicate that a Boolean in Deluge by just writing true or false. Doesn't have to go in quotes, otherwise it'll be treated as a string. And then finally, in Creator, we have lists and maps. So in a lot of other languages, you probably hear this called an array. And a list just has curly braces and then comma-separated values inside it. So you could have a list of numbers, you could have a list of strings, you could also have a list of maps. So if you're writing like API calls and you're getting a bunch of structured data from a system like Zoho CRM, like a list of information about different leads, and it might have the data of 10 different leads in that API response. Oftentimes, that will be a list, and each item in the list will be a map. So what is a map? There's a bunch of ways you could describe this. Oftentimes, you'll see in our documentation, this is described as a key-value pair. And so a map is really just kind of like our version of JSON data, sort of, where you have like, a key, which could refer to like a field in an application, and then a value, which is like the information that is stored inside that field. Syntax. The idea in programming is that your script is going to do exactly what you tell it to do, and nothing more and nothing less. And so you have to really pay attention to the way that Deluge wants you to write a line of code. Otherwise, it's not going to listen to you. So what are the basic syntax rules in Deluge? There's a lot of rules about how variables are named. So when you create a variable, it can't have a space in it. It can't begin with a number, but it can contain a number. And it can't have special characters unless it is an underscore. So variable names, a little tricky. And then statements. So statements always end with a semicolon in Deluge. So anytime you have like a line of code and that is just declaring a variable and assigning some value to it, then you have to end that with a semicolon. And then another thing that, depending on what languages you're familiar with, or if you just don't have a lot of experience with programming languages, may be kind of a weird idea, but the data type is defined based on how you write it. So this kind of goes back to that last slide where like we have quotation marks around the word hello, indicating that it's text data, and we have single quotes around the date, indicating that it's time data. So the way that you write it matters. Okay, so the basic structure of declaring a variable in Deluge just looks like this. Your variable is on the left, that's the name of the variable, equals some value that you put into that variable, then a semicolon. So if I wanted to represent my name by just writing a simple Deluge statement, I can just write my name equals Dylan in quotes, and then a semicolon. And then it depends on what kind of data type we're going for. So my favorite number, just write the number. That's all you have to do. If you want the value to be treated as a decimal and not as an integer, you have to put in the point something something. And obviously with like the value of pi, we kind of get that. But sometimes if it's like a value like 2.0, we may forget to do that. And so that's something that kind of can trip you up when you're getting started. Dates, they have to be formatted the way the dates are formatted in your Zoho Creator application settings. Sometimes, depending on which Zoho application you were writing in, the format of the date can be a little bit different. So that's something to look out for. And you can always just do info zoho.currenttime in whatever application you're writing your script in to kind of see what format it's using. Okay, then Boolean, we don't need any quotes, so is this session great? Probably true. And then this last one is like a list, so list of ingredients, you would just do like curly braces, and then you put all your things with commas in between them. Okay, so here's 3 different ways of representing the same information. Each one of these is going to be a different data type, right? So one of them is an integer, one of them is a decimal, one of them is just text. And if you put a number in text, then that can cause some issues, obviously, because if Deluge thinks, hey, you're not talking about the number 6, you're talking about 6, the string 6, then it's not going to think this is some kind of information that I can, do some addition or multiplication with. It's not going to be something that I could apply some kind of numeric function to. And so you need to make sure you do that right. So when you're writing a script, probably you won't run into that issue. But if you're using something like Creator, there's one common use case that I have found where this happens a lot. So you might have like a drop-down where the options are like 1, 2, and 3. You need somebody to like rank something, and then maybe you need to like sort that list, or you need to like do some kind of numeric operation on that. Well, by putting it in a drop-down, it's actually, when it goes into Deluge, it's treating that as a string of the number 1, a string of the number 2, a string of the number 3. So pay attention in Creator to the field types. Okay, math operators, plus, minus, asterisk for multiplication, slash for division. I think we all get those. So when you do some kind of mathematical operation on an integer and a decimal, your end result is going to be converted into a decimal. So if we did 10, which is y, times z, which is 3.0, it's going to convert it to 30.0. It's not going to just be 30. And then the same thing goes for any kind of operation. So x minus z, which is 5 minus 3.0, it's going to give us 2.0 at the end, right? And then for the last one, y divided by z. So if we had something where it's just going to give us repeating decimal, it does truncate it at a certain point. I feel like it's 10 digits, but I didn't bother to count. Okay, you can also use the plus operator with strings of text. So if we had a value x, which equals hello, and y, which equals world, and then we add those things together, it will give us this final result, hello world. But obviously we see the issue is right here, there is no space between these words. And so when you're concatenating text, you have to remember to insert those spaces. So here's another example showing a couple different approaches to that. One thing is I could just add in a string with a space, and that will solve the problem and give me the proper spacing here. Or I could add in a variable which is equal to a string with a space in it. So that string with a space actually is a value. It's not a null value if it's a string with a space. It looks like nothing to us, but the value is a space. It's not a null value. Okay, and then we have relational operators. So relational operators allow you to compare two different values, and then they allow you to write conditionals or check if a certain condition is true. So we have less than or equal to, which is the caret with the equal sign, greater than or equal to. And then if you want to see if two values are the same, it's just a double equal sign, and if they're not the same, it's an exclamation mark and an equal sign. So given these three values, what is x less than y? What would that evaluate to if we were running a script that was checking for that? True, okay. So 5 less than 10, yeah, sounds right, that'll be true. And so when you're checking a condition in Deluge, it's always just going to give you like a true or a false. Like, is this condition true? Is it something that is happening? Is it false? Is it something that's not happening? All right, so what about this third one here? X greater than z. So if we had done a like caret and an equal sign, then it would have been true, because then we would have been checking, is 5 greater than or equal to 5.0? So it would have been inclusive of 5. But because we just did a greater than, it's not going to be inclusive. 5 is not greater than 5.0. So it evaluates to false. And then the last one, x equal to z. So it will treat the integer and the decimal as being equal. So even though they're different data types, mathematically, it's going to count those as the same, and it would evaluate as true. Okay, so then you can also use the relational operators to compare strings of text. And the important thing to remember when you do this is that it is case sensitive. So if we want to compare as x equal to y, it's going to return false, because one of these has a capital H, one of them has a lowercase h. And then if we wanted to see, are they not equal to each other, it would return true. Now, in Creator, you can also do conditions like contains ignore case or equals ignore case. And so that would allow you to check, are these the same word regardless of casing? Okay, so there's also logical operators. So if we want to check more than one condition at a time, then we can add and or logic into our application. And so the way that you do and logic is a double ampersand sign, and the way that you do or logic is a double vertical bar. If you want to write a vertical bar, you just do shift and backslash. So not the normal slash. Okay, so let's take a look at some of these examples. So this first one, x greater than y. So x is 5, y is 10. Is 5 greater than 10? No. But x is greater than z, 5 is greater than 3.0. So what would happen? What would we get if we tried to evaluate that first condition there? False, that is correct. So because it has the double ampersand, that means there's and logic, and it means both of those conditions have to be met in order for it to be true. And then if we did the same exact thing, but we used the double bar, so we did the or logic, then it would evaluate to true, yes. So because the second condition is true, even though the first one's false, at least one of them was met, so it would evaluate as true. And then if you want to get real fancy, you can have multiple conditions that you're checking for, and then you can also group operations kind of like you do in algebra inside parentheses. And so it would evaluate like this one first. So, z squared would be 9, y is 10, so that would still be true, and then x less than 10, yeah. So I think that last one is true. Okay, so that's how logical operators work. Conditionals. It's just an if this, then that. You want to be able to check for one of those conditions before you take a certain set of actions in your code. And the way that you write conditionals is you just write the word if, and then you have some parentheses where you put your condition that you want to check if it's true or false. And then you have curly braces, and inside those curly braces goes all of the code that you want to execute if that condition has been met. And so there's 3 different types of conditionals in Deluge. There's if, there's else if, and there's else. And the else one basically checks that if none of the if or else if statements that you've put into your code have been met, then only then will it run the else action. And so you don't need any kind of condition after else. That's another thing that people kind of mess up sometimes when they're first learning to write code. Okay, so what's an example of a conditional? Well, if you get a grade that is greater than or equal to 95, then the student will get a high five. That is true. But otherwise, if it is not greater than or equal to 95, if they just got an A minus, but they didn't get the full A, there is no high five, right? So that's one example of representing a real-world situation. Here's another example where we have 3 different conditionals to check for. So in this case, if it's greater than or equal to 95, you get a high five and a pizza party. But if it is less than 95 and greater than or equal to 90, so we're still in that A range, then you get the high five but no pizza. And then if you didn't get an A, you are left with nothing. So you can create a series of conditionals to create a bunch of branching different paths in what your code is going to do. Okay, so variables, data types, syntax, math operators, relational operators, logical operators, conditionals. Dang, that's a lot of stuff. All right, so inside Zoho Creator, what are the ways that we can trigger Deluge scripts? What are all the different places that we can do it? So there's actually quite a few. So the first one, let's start chronologically, is let's say I am adding a record, so I'm going to fill out a form. I could run a workflow that runs a script on load. So all that means is when I open that form, that's when the code is going to run. Or if it's a workflow that I run when a record is edited or created or edited, then what that means is if I go to one of my reports and I click edit on one of my records, and as soon as that form reopens for me to edit the data in there, that's when it would run. So then the next thing after that is I could run a bit of script on user input. So when you see this option when you're setting up a workflow in Creator, basically all that means is when somebody is filling out a particular field, I can execute some script. And so this could also be on add or on edit. So when a record is being created or when a record is being edited. Okay, so then what's the next thing? So now let's say, I'm creating a record, I've opened my form, I've filled out my fields, I go and I click that submit button to save it. So that's where I could run an onValidate script. And so an onValidate just means that some code is going to run as soon as I hit that button, but before the record gets saved into my database. And so this is the last opportunity that I have to check, is this information clear? Is this information accurate? Is this information that I want to accept into my beautiful, pristine Creator app? And so I can give somebody an error message at that point, or cancel their submission if they have tried to put in something that I don't want them to put into my application. Same idea for onValidate for editing a record, except it's just if I had gone into a report and went to update something. But also, we can do a validation script when we go to delete a record. So we can make sure that before somebody deletes something, is this a kind of record that we want them to delete? Or are there a set of steps we maybe want them to go through before they delete this record? So that's our chance to give them some kind of message. And then finally, we can run a script on success. So this just means once a record has been saved, once a record has been updated, or once a record has been deleted, then we could take a set of actions. So those are all of the different points of someone using your application where you can execute a Deluge workflow. Also, you can schedule a script as well. So I could set up a script that runs once a day or once a month, and maybe it like cleans out some junk data, or maybe it just updates some information in my application or sends out a report or something. Okay, so what about the actions that we can take with Deluge? So functions are like the main way that you are going to, take your scripts to the next level and be able to like actually get a lot of stuff done with them. And so function has an input, some stuff happens to that data or that information that you input into it, and then it outputs something at the end. And so you may remember functions from your terrible algebra class that you took in like 8th grade or 7th grade or something, where you have like some kind of formula and you just have to plug stuff into that formula, and then your math teacher makes you draw a million of these things, and you have to plug some number in and see what result it gives you, and that tells you how to plot things on a chart. And so the function has an input and it has an output and gives you some kind of result, right? So with Deluge, it's a similar idea with all of our pre-built functions. And one of the weird things about how programming works is that you don't actually have to know how our function works necessarily. All you really need to know to make use of it is what you're supposed to put inside the function and what you are hoping to get out of it. And if you know those two things and you do that all properly, then everything should go A-OK. So when you're writing functions, the data type that you use is very important, because different functions, different pre-built Deluge functions exist for different data types. So we have like string functions that could maybe make all of your words uppercase, or they could format all of them like proper nouns automatically, where the first letter is capitalized and the rest aren't. We have functions that can like sort a list in a certain order, or functions that could add a certain number of business days onto a start date and then give you that result. So the data type of the function and the data type of the input are completely interconnected. And so we have a lot of built-in functions. This is a list of, I think, most of them. And if you want to play around with these built-in functions right here, which I will now go to. So when you go to that link, this is what you will see. And so this kind of like interactive database of all of the Deluge functions, and they're broken down by what type of data they interact with. So we have text over here. These ones are numeric. And then, there's date ones. If I click on like the calendar, it shows me all the date time functions. And then if I wanted to like mess around with one of these, like this add business day function, first, it gives me a little thing over here about the syntax of it, shows me an example, gives me an explanation of how it works, but also it lets me play around with this too. So I can see, all right, how does this thing actually work? Well, I'm just going to change the number of business days I want to add and click this play button, and it gives me a result here. And so I could just come in here and write any number of different things that I want to run in my code, and it will print it all out right here. So I don't have to like run a test by going all the way into my Creator app and going into the settings and creating a custom function, setting up all the screens. Is it searchable as well? So if I search like business days, it would show me that function. All right, so now let's talk about custom functions. So a custom function has four main things. It has a name, which is important because whatever you name your function is what you're going to use in other places in order to reference that function and trigger it. It has inputs, which in programming are often called arguments. So you may see error messages, or you may see UI messages or documentation that talks about arguments, and you go, what the heck is an argument? It just means the data that has to be input into it. Then there are operations. So that's just the stuff inside the black box. When you build your own function, which we call a custom function, you do have to know how the black box works because you are the one making all the stuff happen. So you write a bunch of code inside your function, and that's how it works. And then there is the output or return at the end of the function. So that's just what data is it supposed to spit out once it's finished executing all of the script. So when you're formatting a function in Zoho Creator, the syntax looks kind of like this. So up at the top, we have the return type first. So that's where we're going to write in a data type of what this function will spit out at the end. Is it going to be text, number, date, map, list, whatever? Then we give our function a name. Then we have parentheses. And inside those parentheses, we kind of follow a similar format where we put in the data type and then the name of the argument. So we might have just one argument, we might have no arguments, or we might have 5 of them. And if there's more than one, you're going to separate each of those with a comma. Then inside these curly braces, that's where you put all of your operations. And then for most functions, you write return, and then whatever like variable or value it is that you want it to spit out at the end. That is how the basic syntax of a function works. So when you go and you first start creating that function, you don't want to delete those curly braces because that's going to cause some problems. So what are the different return types or the different data types that I can write when I'm setting up my function or my arguments? You kind of have to follow these. When you create the function in Creator, it'll give you a drop-down with these, so you don't have to like memorize how you write these. You can actually go and manually type into that syntax in the parentheses, hey, I also need to pass some string into this, and so I just write comma, string, first name or whatever. So if it's a Boolean, it's a bool. If it's a date or a time, you write date. If it's a map or a list, you write map list. If it's a decimal, you write float. If it's an integer, you write int. And then finally, there is void. So if you don't want your function to return anything, you don't want to have to write that return line at the end of it. You just maybe want to write a function that updates some data, but you don't need it to tell you anything at the end. You can just make a void function. And so that's just basically like returning a null value. It's not going to spit anything out at the end. So here's an example of a simple function. The data type it's going to give us is a string. The name of the function is full name. The arguments are 2 strings, the first name and the last name. And so I can pass in my first name value, my last name value, and then what is it going to do to those? Well, it's going to take this name variable and it's going to add a space in between those, and then it's going to print out the full name in one piece of data, right? So this is a very, very simple function, but it kind of gets the idea across pretty clearly. So if you have some data that's maybe just not formatted exactly the way you want it to, and you're going to have to, in multiple places in your app maybe, or in multiple different trigger points, you'll have to reformat that data so you can do something with it. That's when you might want to write a function. Another example, so if we wanted to calculate the area of a circle, we would want to return a float or a decimal, and we would want to pass in just the radius. That's all we need to know, because the area equals pi times radius squared. And so we could calculate all of that by doing area equals 3.14 times radius. And then in this last step, we could return the area, and I put on this little rounding function at the end there. So even when you're returning, you can still apply a function right there, and that will just round our result down to 2 decimal places. Okay, debugging. How does debugging work? Well, when you're writing your scripts, most of the time what you're going to do to debug is you're just going to write info statements. So you just write the word info followed by a variable or followed by, some calculation that you're trying to do, some statement, and that with a semicolon, right? And so, 2 simple examples. If I put in info hello world, it's going to spit out exactly what I put. If I put in info zoho.currentDate, which is like a built-in Deluge function, which will just spit out whatever the current date is whenever I run that. It prints out the date, right? And then I could also do info Mr. plus name with that space in there, so I can do like some kind of operation on my info line. And so the way that you debug your code is basically whenever you don't know exactly where something is working, you put an info statement and you figure out what is this variable giving me at a certain point in my script. And so the place that you put your info statement is going to matter, because I could come in here and I could redefine Tejas in the next line and do name equals Dylan, and then if I put the info after that, it's not going to return Tejas, it's going to return Dylan. Okay, identifying records. So when you identify records, there's a very important thing that goes into databases, which is called like a unique key. So if you think of the idea of like driver's licenses, there could be two guys named Tejas Gadia, and their names wouldn't be unique. Even their birthday might not be unique. There could be two Tejas Gadias born on the same day. And so that is why when you get your driver's license, it always has a driver's license number to differentiate one Tejas Gadia from another. And so inside Zoho Creator and every other Zoho app, we will automatically always generate that unique key, that unique piece of information that is only going to apply to one record at a time. So you have to remember that when you're working with your data, you might just see names, emails, phone numbers, like information that means something to you. But Creator or Deluge can also see some kind of unique number that has been assigned to each one of those records. And that is hidden in the background. And in Creator, you can actually go in and you can edit your report and drag on that ID if you wanted to see what it looks like. But that information is very useful to know when you get into integration tasks or API calls or fetching records, because that allows you to access one very specific record with complete, 100% guaranteed, I'm going to find the record of Ambrose Merton or whoever that is if I put in his ID number. Okay, so Zoho integration tasks are basically shorthand ways of writing API calls that are included in Deluge. And so the way they work is basically you have a variable which is just going to hold the API response, and then that is equal to Zoho dot service, so some application, dot whatever action I want to do or whatever API call I'm trying to make, and then in parentheses you may or may not have some parameters or some data that you want to pass in that call. And so these integration tasks support Crud Operations. So Crud Operations mean you can create data, you can create records, you can read records, you can update them, you can delete them, all the basic things that you would want to do in a database or an application. So here's a list of a bunch of the CRM integration tasks. So I could write zoho.crm.create, and then you'll see that each one of these will have its own like documentation that goes with it, but if I want to create a record in Zoho CRM, I have to say a module, so is it a lead, is it a contact, is it a deal? And then I have to say parameters, and there will be a certain structure to how the API accepts that information. That's what the parameters are. But there's all kinds of other examples here. So I could get a record by its ID. So maybe if I had a record's ID, just because I can access that when my script is triggered, or maybe I did some other prior API call to get that ID, maybe that could be useful. I could update records, all kinds of things I can do. So here's an example of a simple one. So these are the parameters that I would put if I was going to add a lead into my CRM. And so I would create a map. And so maps, oftentimes when you write the script, this is kind of one of the few examples where you don't just write it and define it right there, but I would just say, all right, there's a variable, lead map, and that is a map variable. And then on each subsequent line, I'm just putting one key value pair into that map. So if you're familiar with like JSON data or XML data, it's kind of like the same idea where you have like, what is that field? What am I putting in it? And so the important thing to get right here is like, what are the names of those keys that Zoho CRM will recognize and accept? And you can actually go into your Zoho CRM settings and see what those are. And then if I want to actually create the record, this is what I would write. So zoho.crm.createRecord, and then I'd say which module I'm trying to make the record in, so I just put in leads. And then this is where all my parameters go, so all that stuff I defined up there, I just dump in with this one little variable, and then the response is going to be what Zoho CRM tells me when I try to do this. So it might tell me, this didn't work, and you have messed it up, and here's how you've messed it up. Or it might tell me, great, I did it, everything is fine. And so when you run this function in something like Zoho Creator, you will see a few different parts. So first, you'll have your function open, you'll finally be ready to test it out, and you'll go, okay, I'm going to hit save, and I'm going to execute this thing. And when you go to execute a function, it's going to ask you what those arguments are, because you're just executing it, just sitting there instead of like from some other trigger point in your application where you maybe could have defined those arguments automatically. And so you'll have to type in the email or the name or whatever it is. And then it'll give you a result at the end. It'll tell you if this thing ran successfully without any errors. And it will give you, if you've written any info statements, this thing of log messages, which spits out whatever variable it is you wrote the info statement for. So in this example, you'll notice that it's hard to read, but this is a void function, so it's not really supposed to return us anything, but because we wrote info CRM response, it tells me all of the stuff that the CRM API is responding with. So that's what the log messages are, where all of your infos go. This is what an error looks like. This is what a successful one looks like. Okay, looping. So we're almost at the end here. So the idea of looping is just running through a list of items and taking an action for each one of those items. So in Deluge, we do not have while loops. So we can't just like run it forever and forever and forever. But if you have like a set of records in your Creator app or your CRM or some other database, you can run through and execute an action for each one of those records. Or if you have like a list variable defined somewhere, you can run through and take actions for each item in the list. So the way that you write a loop is you just say for each, and then you define some variable, which can be whatever you want to call it, and that'll just refer to each item on the list, in, and then you give the list of items, or the set of records, and then you put curly braces, and then you define what's going to happen. So what's a simple example? Let's say we have this list of speakers where John and Billy were just really lazy and they did not format their names very nicely at all. So one thing we could do is we could create a new list called new speaker list, and then we could loop through all of the speakers in our original speaker list, Tejas, John, Billy, and take this set of actions. So each time we get one of those people, we're going to add them to our new speaker list, but we're going to apply this proper function, .proper, and so that will reformat their names into like a proper noun format. At the end, we have an info to see what our final result is, and so if we ran the script, it would get rid of the weird capitalization or lack of capitalization and spit out a nice list of names. So, slightly more advanced, but this is all the stuff we just covered. Great. You guys now know how to code. Congratulations.